Before a jury hears a case, before any evidence is presented, before opening statements begin, something quieter happens first. A review. Not of what happened, but of what is allowed to be shown. Because in court, evidence does not speak for itself. It must be evaluated, filtered, tested against procedure. And sometimes, it never makes it past that stage. Not because it's false, not because it's unreliable, but because of how it was obtained. In this case, the defense does not dispute the discovery of narcotics. They do not challenge the search results. They do not deny the arrest. Instead, they focus on something smaller, something less visible, a span of time most people overlook. Because the question is not what was found. It is not even how it was found. It is whether the detention remained lawful every second it continued. And if it didn't, nothing that followed can be used. To answer that question, the court reconstructs the encounter as a timeline, not a story, a sequence. Each moment measured, each action placed in order. The driver's license is returned, a warning is issued, and the driver is told he is free to go. That statement matters because it marks the end of the traffic stop. The purpose of the stop has been fulfilled. The violation has been addressed. The documentation is complete. The authority tied to that stop is over. Everything after that point is different. Any continued interaction must now be voluntary or supported by new, clearly defined suspicion of criminal activity. The officer asks a follow-up question. It's a request, not a command. And that distinction matters because the driver is allowed to refuse. And he does, calmly, clearly. I'd rather go. That refusal reinforces the transition that already occurred. The encounter, at that moment, should end. Nothing has escalated. Nothing appears unusual. And that's exactly why this moment is easy to miss. Because what happens next doesn't look dramatic. There's no argument, no raised voice, no visible tension, just a decision. The officer instructs the driver to wait. A K-9 unit is requested, and the detention continues, even though the driver was told he was free to leave. This is the point where the legal analysis changes. The traffic stop is no longer the focus. The focus becomes the delay. Time begins to pass. 1 minute, nothing changes. 2 minutes, still nothing. 5 minutes, 7 minutes. And during that entire period, no new violation is identified. No new evidence is articulated. No additional facts are introduced. Only time extends the encounter, and time alone is not enough. The law does not prohibit officers from investigating, but it does regulate how that investigation is conducted. To extend a detention beyond its original purpose, there must be specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable officer to suspect criminal activity. Not a possibility, not a feeling, a justification. In this case, the observations are documented. The driver appeared nervous. His travel explanation contained inconsistencies. These details are noted, considered, but they are not sufficient, because nervousness is common, and inconsistency by itself is not uncommon. If those factors alone justified extended detention, almost any roadside encounter could be prolonged indefinitely. That is not the standard. The standard requires something more, something specific, something objective. And here, that threshold is not met. 7 minutes after the stop should have ended. The K-9 unit arrives. The dog is deployed, and it alerts. From an investigative standpoint, this appears to confirm suspicion, but confirmation after the fact does not justify the delay that came before it, because the legality of the search depends on the legality of the detention, and the detention is evaluated based on what was known at the time it was extended, not what was discovered afterward. The search proceeds. The trunk is opened, and inside, a large quantity of narcotics is found, packaged, distributed, consistent with trafficking. There is no ambiguity, no uncertainty. The evidence is clear. But in court, clarity is not the only requirement. The method matters, because each step in the process is connected. The detention leads to the K-9 deployment. The K-9 leads to the alert. The alert leads to the search. The search leads to the evidence. And if one step in that chain is unlawful, everything that follows becomes compromised. That principle is central to the court's analysis. The evidence is not evaluated in isolation. It is evaluated as a result of the actions that produced it. And here, the determining factor is the delay, because the detention continued beyond its lawful scope. The search that followed is considered unconstitutional, and the evidence obtained from that search cannot be introduced at trial, not challenged, not minimized, excluded, removed entirely from consideration. To the jury, it does not exist. They do not see the narcotics. They do not hear about the K-9 alert. They are not presented with the results of the search, because legally, those events are no longer part of the case. Without admissible evidence, the prosecution cannot proceed. Charges are dropped, not because the evidence was weak, but because it cannot be used. This outcome is often misunderstood. It is not a failure to detect criminal activity. It is a failure to maintain constitutional compliance. Throughout the duration of the encounter, the boundary that was crossed is not visible. It is not announced. It exists in timing, in authority. In the moment the driver was told he was free to leave, and then was not allowed to leave. That contradiction becomes the central issue, and once it occurs, it cannot be undone. The most significant detail in this case is not the discovery. It is the extension, because the case was not lost when the evidence was reviewed. It was not lost when the charges were filed. It was not lost in the courtroom. It was lost in the minutes after the stop had already ended. Minutes that appeared routine. Minutes that did not draw attention. Minutes that changed everything. In roadside enforcement, the greatest constraint is not resistance. It is time. Seconds define authority. Minutes define legality. And once that boundary is exceeded, the consequences are not immediate. They appear later. During review, during analysis, during proceedings where every action is measured. The narcotics were real. The arrest was real. The investigation was real. But the detention extended beyond its lawful limit. And in court, legality defines admissibility. The evidence didn't disappear in the courtroom. It disappeared the moment the clock kept running. Because in the justice system, cases are not decided only by what is discovered, but by whether the process used to discover it withstands scrutiny. And when it doesn't, the outcome is already determined.